You are all here and listening to our first live podcast about all our staff's favourite books. Mr Holland has very, very kindly agreed to be my first guest, and it's really delightful to have him, and particularly the book he has chosen, which I've actually ordered because it sounds so interesting on my research. I'm going to ask him to first tell us a little bit about it and why he enjoys it so much.
Right, okay. Invisible Cities is its title, Invisible Cities, by Italo Calvino. And he is an Italian writer, or he was, I think he died a few years ago, 20th century writer. It's a book that I read when I was at university, and it's not a long book at all. It's not a big, thick, heavy, sort of massive sort of novel kind of thing. It is just a short collection. Well, it is a story. There is a narrative to it. It does follow Marco Polo's journeys through China. So
I
it's
read a
based
lot
on
of comments saying it was like a travel fiction, really, like a travelogue almost.
Yeah, a travelogue, but in a very dreamy kind of way. It's a fantasy story in a way, and I think that's why it appeals to me. I quite like fantasy stories, but it's nothing like sort of Lord of the Rings or lots of sort of dragons and wizards and things. It is just it's a story of Marco Polo, who of course is a real person. He traveled off to China, and he went traveling and met the Chinese king, or whoever's in charge, and we know that this is a real story, but because it was so distant and so unimaginable for the time of when it actually happened in the Middle Ages, it must have felt, even to people at the time, that it was a magical, mysterious land that would never really be seen by most people. So this whole story is written as if it's a kind of dreamlike evocation of somebody traveling through a very weird, mysterious world, often where the laws of physics don't apply, it's that kind of dreaminess where you have sudden transformations and things fold in on themselves, or things emerge and then they mutate. Ostensibly, it's a story based on a conversation between Marco Polo and Kublai Khan, and I think Marco Polo is telling Kublai Khan, it's been a few years now since I read it, but I think Marco Polo who's telling him about the cities that he's visited in his own kingdom, I think. Oh gosh, I'm not sure.
No, I think you're right, because the sort of summary that I read very much stated that he had gone to visit Khan and to essentially tell him these stories at the end of his life. So he was reflecting on his empire, and Marco Polo was one of his many visitors. And what he wanted from him was stories to allow him safe passage through the rest of the land.
Oh, that's good. That's good. And that ties in also with a lot of those similar sort of stories from those periods, like the 1001 Nights, the tales of the nights and stuff, where you've got storytelling within a story. And again, that's something that really appeals to me. I've always loved the idea of a story within a story within a story, and this is one of those books, but it's very short. I mean, it is. I think it's about 100 pages long, if that, and each section stands on its own. They're more like little prose poems than a long continuous narrative, and I think that's what I liked about it, because
there's something quite mythic about it, isn't it? They're kind of like epic poems all about all these different places that he's supposedly been to, which can't possibly be real.
No, that's right. And all of them have their own legends attached to them. So each city that he visits is famous for something. And that might be something often sort of emotional or something sensory. So you've got, for example, I think there's a city of memories, or there's a city which I think changes while you're there. There's a city with a map of the entire universe in it, or something like that. There's one that really struck me as being, because although it's fantasy, there's also quite a lot, what appeals to me is in any kind of sort of writing is when something seems very familiar and sort of expresses something that actually we all feel but never really manage to articulate ourselves. There's one city that he says everybody has an image of this city before they go to it, and everybody's image is of something like this or something like that, and then when you arrive there, then you see the city and you've forgotten the image of what you had in your mind. And that's so true. There's so many places that I've wanted to visit and I've had it in my mind what they're like, but once I've visited that place, that image that I had beforehand is kind of gone. It's been sort of buried now under the reality of what I've seen, and so there's all sorts of experiences and adventures. It's not full of drama and excitement. It's a very gentle story, but it's just very poetic. And the whole sort of sequence of stories without joining together into one big story make it again a bit like dreams, really. When you wake up from your dreams, it's a kind of narrative that you've just experienced in lots of different sections that don't always join up, do they? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's got a really good commentary about the way that we do travel as well. That sense of exoticism and ignorance we can often have in going to these places that we think we know because we've seen them on the news or we've read a book about them. And the reality is that often they change you in ways that you don't expect, that the dreaminess to them is almost like a real traveling experience, isn't it? You've been somewhere and you come back and everything else looks different suddenly.
That's really interesting, isn't it? I hadn't thought of it like that, and that's a really good point there. I think that you're making in the sense that we do, we think we're shaping the world, and actually our own experiences then feed back into us, and we are slightly transformed by them. I quite like that. Yeah, I see what you mean.
I'm delighted with myself now. I did actually, so I've got another one for you. This might be a slightly tricky question, I apologise. But a lot of the work I was reading was actually by Jeanette Winterson, who calls this one of her favourite novels. And she says that,
that's interesting. She's the author of, is it Oranges?
Well, Not the Only Fruit. Yeah. She's and she writes a lot of kind of LGBT and feminist fiction, and one of the reasons she said she likes this one so much is because all the cities have female names, and when he recollects the story,
they do. You're right. Yes, they do.
She wonders if the novel is a fair reflection on how history is written by men and their journey through history, and how that affects primarily the women in these female cities, and whether or not as a result, I mean, she would argue this, but I'm going to ask you, would you therefore call this a fairly feminist novel?
That's really interesting. I would feel on very dangerous ground to have an opinion on that myself. I'm sure. But you've got it's a very good point that all the cities are feminine names, and the if I dared to sort of risk the idea that it certainly moves away from as I've said to you, sort of already in a way, the whole structure and the more reflective nature, if I sort of dare go down this line, has a slightly more feminine quality to it than your archetypal masculine epic, full of lots of active moments and fighting and drama. This is much more of a kind of perhaps more reflective, more inward looking. If that's seen as more feminine, then possibly yes.
Which is interesting when you think that the person telling the story is the history of Marco Polo as someone as this very masculine adventure, this kind of Indiana Jones figure of history, isn't it?
It is, but in the hands of Italo Calvino, he's transformed into, you're right, into a storyteller much more than an adventurer. He's clearly, you said that it's the end of his life, so that obviously plays a role possibly that he's reflecting on things. But he's become a narrator, he's become a storyteller, hasn't he? And he's no longer the active explorer romping through the fields and the cities and the lands. He's sitting down and he's recounting stuff. I see what you mean, but they are two, both explorers and emperors are your archetypal masculine figures and characters, aren't they, in a way, throughout history, throughout a sort of traditional literature. You've got two very, very archetypal masculine characters there, sitting down for a chat and a reflection. So in some ways those stereotypes are being undermined by the way that he's portraying them both.
Which does make it a slightly subversive novel, really, I suppose, in that manner then.
Yes, absolutely, because if you pick up a book about Marco Polo's travels, you expect a book of daring do, don't you, really? At the very least, from the 19th century sort of period into the early 20th century, you're expecting at least Wilbur Smith or excitement and stuff. This is not at all. This is a very slow-paced and deliberately blurred kind of book. Whether that still feeds into the feminist argument, I don't know, but certainly it's subversive, and I think that's definitely worth bearing in mind. It's not a normal novel, but then none of Italo Calvino's novels are normal. He's any of my year 12 pupils who remember when I've talked to them about a book list, one of the books is Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveller, and that is chapter after chapter starts the story again. Every time you just get into a chapter, it then says, oh, but the rest of the book's missing, and so you take it back to the bookshop and she gives you a different copy, but that's got a different opening, and then you start the next chapter, and you end up with about 12 chapters that eventually interweave into one clever story. It's brilliantly done. It's almost sometimes a bit sort of too clever, possibly, but it's but it's a different way of approaching a novel, really different way of approaching something like this. It's not simply linear, and I think there's another reason why you might argue that it's not that it's quite subversive, in the sense that it's definitely not a linear story of an explorer going from A to B to C to D. It is much more exploring feelings and ideas and moods, actually.
That links in so nicely with my next question, actually, as well, because there's a lot about the book that talks about how it has almost quite a Buddhist philosophy and how cyclical it is, which links to the style you're mentioning with his other texts, and that it has this kind of urban samsara, this idea of wandering repetitively through time and through place, and feeling that you're on a loop, and like you said, that dreamlike quality to it. Do you think that there's a kind of reflective intent to that, or is that really just the skill of a writer taking on an abstract form? Do you think there's something philosophical about this book, for instance, or is that just clever storytelling and unique storytelling?
Oh, I think it's a bit of both, but I'm sure he loves this. He loves, I think, as a writer, he loves to play around with forms and structures, and therefore it's clearly the skill of a good writer who's playing with your expectations as a reader, and wanting to thwart your expectations, which I always think is what you want out of a good book, actually. I think is to have to at each stage be slightly caught off guard and find yourself going in a different direction. But I think the cyclical element is well, that's interesting. Whether it's particularly Buddhist, I'm not sure, but certainly I think we're going back down the line, I guess, of me mentioning dreamlike. I think probably meditative is a good word there, actually, that you don't actually get a sense of which city he visited first, or whether he's talking, but quite where is he when he's talking, and when are they talking, and then every so often one or two of the cities have very modern elements in. There's some technology that we recognise from the 20th century, and so you're suddenly questioning whether this is Marco Polo in a modern guise, and are these timeless figures? Are they talking out of time? Absolutely, they're talking out of time. I think they're slightly portrayed as sort of universal figures who are meditating on life and travel. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, though.
No, I like it. The fact that the book itself is sort of reflective in both style and intent, which is nice.
Yeah.
I think as well, talking about those ideas of people, anyone in time sharing ideas of history, if you were going to write something like this yourself, which two figures of history would you use in place of Marco Polo and Kublai Khan?
Oh, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Oh, which two figures to sort of sit down and discuss things with, I guess. Is that
any two people you think I could create a really interesting dialogue between you, or could do something with this in terms of what you'd want them to chat about and share?
Gosh, yeah, I mean, that in a way, it's like the old story. It's the old question about who would you like most to have at your dinner party. And I guess what's interesting in terms of Calvino's book is he's chosen two people who I either did meet or could have met at the same time, because they are contemporary figures. So he's chosen to go with that. And you've got a number of, sorry to go slightly off track here, but it's just suddenly come to my mind. One of the stories I remember, a play that I studied at university, was Maria Stuart, by the German writer Schiller. And he has them meet. He has Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary meet in the middle scene in the play, which of course they never did. They never met, Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots. They didn't meet, but he wanted them to meet in his play, and it makes for a really tantalizing moment at the centre of the play. And I wonder, to answer your question, whether I would like two people who from the same period, but who never. I tell you what, there would be a great meeting between Churchill and Hitler. That would be great. Wouldn't it be good? Because they exchanged a lot of vitriol over the airwaves, didn't they? They knew each other's, you know, they were fighting each other very personally, weren't they? It was a real personal thing, but they never met before the war, you know, at all. So I wonder what a meeting between those two would have been like. That would have been.
It would be really interesting to see if it stayed political the whole time, if this turned into like a political debate or an attempt for an appeasement, or if actually they ended up delving into their own personal philosophies.
Yeah. Oh, I think I like that idea. I think we should have. I think I should write a dialogue with Hitler.
Please do.
I'm right. It's there. I'm starting.
Get cracking right now. I'll let you do it.
I think that sounds good. I think I'll go with those two. I think
That's a really bold choice. I wasn't expecting that at all.
No, nor was I, actually.
Like, who comes to mind quite quickly? Hitler. I want to see what kind of that.
No, it's just interesting to think about the kind of conversations between people who would never have met. I'm presuming that Marco Polo didn't meet Kublai Khan. I'm presuming.
I think also as well, what you've come up with twice there with the Elizabeth and Mary one and Hitler and Churchill is two people in a rivalry, not just two people who would be able to talk and share stories, but people who have an active reason to fight as well.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That's right. You're absolutely right. I've gone straight for the conflict scene, haven't I? I'm afraid. But no, you're right. That's interesting. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Holland, for doing that. I really recommend people go and order the book. I certainly have. And as he has told us several times, it's quite short, which means that it's not going to be a hefty one to get through, and likely because of the chapters of the cities you can dip in and out of it. Am I right there, Paul?
Yeah, you can, absolutely. You can dip in and out of it. It's I mean, it's best read from beginning to end, because there is I do remember I decided to buy myself a copy again because I haven't read it for so long, and I think you're absolutely right. I think you can just dip in and out because each little description is rather beautiful, so you can dip in as little sort of prose poems. But I think my memory of it is that there is a sense of narrative arc to the whole thing, but very gently. So yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think I'll get back to that. I think I'll order that this afternoon.
Good, me too. I hope lots of other people do as well. And if they do, they can send us in their reviews and maybe their own suggestions for who they'd like to meet in history. And if they can top yours, that's a great start. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mr. Holland. We hope you've enjoyed your chat with us, and we hope everyone has enjoyed listening. Next week, we're having Miss Shay on to do the same thing. So we look forward to that. And these will be released every Friday. Thank you again, Mr. Holland.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.